Welcome to the X Factor podcast. I'm your host, Charles Epstein. Today, I am joined by Dr. Christopher R. Larison, Associate Professor at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Did I pronounce that right? Or Urbana?
No, that's right on the spot.
Okay, well, good start. Dr. Larison's research includes studying the use of technology to improve mental health services and social interventions. His research examines how digital tools, including social media data, electronic health records, mobile apps, and emerging AI systems can be leveraged to understand mental health needs, reduce disparities, and enhance access to care. He has led and collaborated on projects using large-scale digital data, e.g. Twitter, Reddit, and administrative health records to study financial stress, student loan debt, and mental health outcomes, and is currently developing and testing technology-enabled peer and AI-supported interventions for anxiety and undeserved populations. I'm going to need a little bit of a break, come up with some air.
No, it's a long-winded event.
Yeah, this is soliloquy, man. Chris also contributes to institutional leadership in data security and digital risk through roles as a high-risk data security faculty fellow and service on university digital governance committees, integrating ethical, secure, and applied technology use into both research and practice. Chris, welcome.
Oh, thanks for having me, Charles. I really appreciate it. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Same. Actually, our first conversation, I say this very often, but our first conversation leading up to this couldn't in and of itself been a podcast.
Yes. It would have been a podcast of Charles and Chris. So.
Yes. We have to take this on the road. But and also, let me applaud your self-restraint, because I know this CV could have gone on for pages and pages and pages. So thank you for that. Anyway, thanks so much for joining me. I got to ask straight away, what is a high-risk data faculty fellow, and what would I have to do to become one?
Yeah, I love that question. I'm the first one ever. and it's a funny story because I'm a social worker, right? And primarily my area of expertise is in mental health services, right? Which is a lot of implementation stuff. And I don't know, maybe a decade ago, because I do a lot of primary data collection with people with SMI, which then tends to be high risk, right? And you have to be careful with the data. And then if you're adding any of the HIPAA data in, and really in this very interesting way, I don't know, like 15 years ago or a decade ago, a group of mental health clinics were really struggling with trying to tell people what they do, right? What the good things that they accomplish. And I think a lot of community mental health does that, right? They do accomplish a lot of things. And so my suggestion to them had been, listen, why don't we gather up all of your data that you have, all of your clinical data? We'll bring all 13 centers together. We'll bring it onto the campus here, and we'll just start to analyze it and take a look at what's going on with you. And as we started to, and you know community mental health, like 13 of them wanted to do this. I got them to sign business agreements. We got through. I get back up to the university. They're like, we're not HIPAA compliant. We can't sign any of these business agreements, which then started a 5-year journey into like, how do we get to be HIPAA compliant? We're not a hospital-based, there's not a hospital with us, right? Carl has become part of us and we're part of Carl, but it's not quite the same as like, I don't know, Michigan's a medical school, right? And so it made sense we didn't, and we did. We went through a process. The campus HIPAA compliant, but the end result of this is that I suddenly got tagged as somebody that A, was very patient, and B, sort of understood high risk data. And this did result in a 2015 report that comes out of the university where they try to look at how should we be doing better tech for researchers across board, not just high risk stuff. And I was part of that, and they had been taking a very traditional approach, and I sort of at some point mid-process, which is probably not the best place to do it, said, hey, listen, why don't we rethink this and go out and spend a little bit of time talking to the professors and asking them what they wanted. And this was like rocket science, apparently. Like, oh my God, I had never thought of that.
Right.
And they were, given that they are generally tech people I've run across are very reasonable people. The academics, if I had done this, would have been up in arms. The tech people are like, sure, we'll switch it up. That seems like a better idea. And it did. And then this fit with my mental health stuff and services and interventions because at the end of the day, I'm often interested like how do people get into services? How do services work? How do clinicians pick up particular skills? Like all these things are fascinating and they fit well in the world of IT tech and certainly in the high risk data world, right? Where you get there's a lot of rules, there's all kinds of services involved with this. Like how do you convince people to use these services? How do you teach them to use them? How do they even get to know that they're available? That's usually one of the biggest things on a huge campus like this is they're often offering a lot of services out. So I don't know. Would that then lay dormant for almost a decade? I went on my way and did a bunch of other stuff, and they reemerged. I don't know, maybe 5 years ago, and said, "Hey, listen, we're really interested in sort of re-talking about this." And there were some changes dynamically at the federal level. CUI data, controlled, unclassified information, came into being, which was going to affect a lot of data on campus, not just our campus, but a lot. And the rules are huge and they're very technically oriented and all these other things. And so my job with them is a lot of like talking about how do you implement these rules? How do you engage faculty in a way that's in a partnership and to ensure that you're going to accomplish the tasks that are necessary that we're meeting all these high risk needs, right? And so that is what it is. It's one of my favorite part of my job. So it's very unusual. And again, I'm the first. We certainly, I know the CIO's office who I work for would be interested in more faculty being interested in this, like in seeing the value of it.
Interesting. So, I guess the one word answer to that question, how does one become a high risk data faculty fellow, is circuitously.
Yeah, yeah, very circuitously.
That's the one word, but no, I appreciate that. So, I want to get into this study that you recently did on the use of AI in therapeutic interventions and your work in developing and fine tuning a TheraBot. Fascinating stuff, particularly how it guards against the risk factors and all of that. But before we get into it, I'm curious, do you have any data at your fingertips as far as a breakdown of age groups, who's using AI for therapy more than others?
You've seen some attempt to do this. I mean, the companies know. I mean, this is the fascinating part of it, right? They have a very good understanding of their users, but they are closed entities.
Mm,
And so none of us really fully understand. And so you'll see just classic survey work. Like JAMA's had a couple of pieces come out where they've surveyed, 1,000 people, somebody has, and asked them about their AI use. There's one that came out in 2025 that was around youth. And maybe the one distinction here was that younger people were more likely to be engaged with it than older people, but most reported positive things. And there was no really standout demographic that said,
mm,
okay, here's who's using it. So I think it's very hard to judge right now who's engaging with it, who isn't engaging with it. My guess is it's those people that are most internet savvy.
yeah.
Yeah,
I was
yeah.
going
And
to say it probably tracks with general adoption rates.
that's right. That would just be my guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it makes me wonder. Like one of the things we'd like to do right now, like which is surprisingly not that easy to do, is to convince like Chestnut or some of the other community mental health centers just to let us come in and ask clients, "Are you actually using this?" So it's the community mental health setting is primarily SMI, which is fascinating right onto itself, and this group is, we often had thought in the past, even around phones, internet access, Zoom, like all these things, we always presume that they're not great users or their access is pretty poor because of like monetary issues, right? And interest, like all these things, none of which has really panned out. The clients tend to pick them up very not much differentially than the general public. And we'd be curious to see like what are some of the threads that people are developing using this tool in an attempt and oftentimes, right, if they're still going to the community mental health center, they're using it as an assistive tool.
Mhm.
So it would be fat like those kinds of things. Is there variance by diagnosis? Is there variance by age? Is there variance by gender? Right, might be some really interesting things. But to be honest with you, we really don't understand that very well.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
I was just curious about that. So, this study that I really want to dig into, titled From Reddit to Generative AI Evaluating Large Language Models for Anxiety Support, Fine Tuned on Social Media Data. So, first, how was this study conducted and what was its aim? Or put another way, what were the gaps in the
yeah.
extant studies that you're looking to address?
So I don't know, like there's so many gaps in generative AI and mental health. I don't know if we're I think the gap that maybe we are attempting to address here is at the highest level of that paper is can we develop a model of assessing these things that is good at sort of both tuning and evaluating the models at performing in mental health kinds of ways, right? Whether it's classic clinical interventions. Our approach was a little bit, TheraBot is a very specific name. That is the name of Princeton's TheraBot, which I'm assuming we'll get to. And we called ours Peer Game. And it, our difference here was we were sort of interested, could we replicate a peer? Right? There's a lot of interest in peer-based work,
Yes.
and I think there's enough legitimate concern of like, do you really want to turn over therapy sessions to a generative AI model? And as I said, we'll get to the Princeton piece. It's very good, So I'm not as concerned as maybe as others, but we thought, listen, peers sort of make sense. We could we can gather peer-based data off of the internet, right? So most of the time when you see people engaging in social media around mental health, it's a peer-to-peer interaction. It's not the things that you see on most social media pieces are not the therapist talking to somebody who has depression, but it's two people that have depression that have decided it's worth their while to sort of share stories.
Hmm.
And if you think about the AA model, that's sort of what they do around
Yes.
substance use, right? Same thing. And I think you see that. And so what we knew was that we could go to Reddit, and this is before there were rules around Reddit. So I want to be clear about that. We were not doing something that Reddit didn't want at the particular time. They would not allow people to do this right now, or there would be a much larger process of going through this. But what we did was there's a subreddit for anxiety, and it has 600,000 users. We thought those are peers. These are peer to peer interactions, right? And so nobody has any of these other peer to peer interactions in that sort of large scale number around a specific diagnosis, anxiety in this case. And so we did. We started with scraping about 500,000 interactions and 1.5 million comments. And, just that initial cleaning, which things are like garbagey, just empty items, things that didn't contain any information. That number went right down to about 400,000 sort of interactions on there. And from there, we were like interested in like good peer interactions. That set of cleaning then resulted in about 26,000 interactions that we thought were legitimately good peer interactions around anxiety that we could then do two things. We used 21,000 of those to tune the model, and that's on top of it, right? We don't get access to the base model, but you can anybody can tune on top of it by adding things to it, right? And then then you have to evaluate it. So we saved 5,000 of those interactions as things that we could prompt it with and then see like how responsive is it, what does it look like, how is it working, right? And so that's the process that was initially put into place.
So once you fine tuned on this subreddit having to do with peers talking about anxiety, what did you find? What did that start to look like?
Yeah, so it was sort of funny. So the first thing is we're a team of CS, and there's three of us. The lead author, one of the middle authors, and myself, the last author. So the three of us are the primary team, and so what it looks like is a combination of CS evaluations and classic like mental health service evaluations. So we try to combine these two together in sort of an evaluative model, a conceptual model of how we would start to understand this thing working, so that we got both a CS perspective as well as like this classic mental health services perspective on what we're seeing. And so the model does combine things like the classic metrics that you'll see out of anything coming out of like chat or Claude, for instance. I've been hearing a lot about Claude lately, and those are like toxicity. And you have some questions about this that we'll get to about sort of like consistency, and they tend to be about the language, right? Just like how good is this language, and then toxicity issues. It's sort of a proper perception is like, is this a toxic response to you? um, are very classic, and then they're combined up with we brought in clinicians, and we fed them a bunch of these interactions out of four things. So there were four models here. We used Chat and Llama, and it was Chat 3.5 and Llama 2. And then we tuned both of them. So we had four models to look at, right? And so we would pump out examples of these. A small group of clinicians would then rate them across some of these things that are both, some crossover between the CS and then bringing in the mental health stuff. And so you can see when we get to our findings, like, we would really had hope, for instance, that like things like bias and toxicity would go down. And, I've thought a lot about this, and I think there's good reasons for that. But in fact, the opposite happened, right?
Yeah, yeah, I want to talk about your findings. So, having fine tuned on that data, you say that it improved accessibility and coherence. Um, I understand what you mean by accessibility, but perhaps you could expand on that. But what do you mean by coherence?
Just the coherence of the language, that it appears like it's a well put together set of sentences. It's something that is it's coherent. Yeah, I don't know how to say it better than using the. It is much like the accessibility piece. These are really base end pieces, right? Where you're talking about language performance kinds of issues that have been long standing metrics within the LLM world. You know,
Yeah, you mentioned toxicity and inappropriate content, and how some of your findings also indicated how it diminishes the capacity for empathy and sympathy. So, how did that all work
Yeah,
out?
so it's a combination. So I've thought a lot about this, Charles, because it is not what we were hoping for, right? The goal here is by fine tuning something, you'll actually get it to perform better in the ways that you want it to. And given that we were drawing all this information out of Reddit, which is this peer-based interaction, and it was out of anxiety, and we had carefully cleaned all these things right down to like, we knew what these 26,000 interactions look like. um, but the more I've sort of thought about it, to be honest with you, it makes sense. If you think about Reddit and you think about peer interactions, and even if you thought about like AA, they tend to be a little less formal, right, and a little less sycophantic than generative AI is. In a classic, I can remember when I would do some of this work as a clinician. I mean, giving pushback is important, right? Not being, and certainly in a peer setting, right? And if you think about Reddit interactions, right, there's probably a lot more like, is that like a pushback on the way that you're presenting the reality around you, which is not untypical in a clinical way, but from a generative AI measure of like that, it's it's not friendly. You're given pushback, and if you think about the suicide stuff, this is part of the problem, right? It's a spiral where there's no point where the generative AI is giving you pushback about problematic thoughts, right? because it's not sure what to do. It's not that's not its mode. Its mode is what can I do here to help you and to confirm what's going on. And most of the stuff that you would see in Reddit, even if it's confirmatory, doesn't tend to be sycophantic.
It's interesting. Usually the studies and the writing and just the anecdotes that I typically come across, and I think people typically come across, is how generative AI is used in a more traditional therapeutic setting, which is to say, a more standard traditional therapist patient interaction. Peer, I think, changes that dynamic, perhaps considerably. Um, to what extent does it? And it seems to me that that might introduce more variables to make it even a greater challenge to come up with a bot that operates much like a peer.
Yeah, I think it's one of the hardest things. So if you can if it our next move is to essentially pump more information into this thing, right? And so, there's we can develop knowledge graphs around clinical interactions in mental health settings. We can feed it the literature. To be honest with you, like what are the evidence-based practices out of Cochrane, all these things, but as you start to feed it more information like this, right, it will become less and less like a peer. So that's going to be one of the most difficult things. We're going to want this thing to have a great depth of knowledge here, but how is it that that knowledge is used in a way that actually looks like a peer? And I think that that's a hard.
So it
That's going
strikes
to take.
me, so there's sort of
Yeah.
a paradox at the center of this. The more you train, the less likely it is to behave like a peer.
That would be sort of my guess, and so how do you control that? Because I suspect that or not suspect, what we want out of the training is that it creates safety, right? By giving you all the best information around, say, treating somebody with anxiety, that you're going to be less the program's gonna be less apt to do things that are going to be inappropriate or harmful. But at some point, like, does that level of information make it very hard to have a peer-like affect?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, were there any surprises that came out of this? Positive, negative?
I think that the one surprise that's sort of nice is that generally both Chat and Llama were not bad untuned. You know,
Mm.
like they have gotten better. I I I I I do think that we're going to need to continue, like, to develop chats and programs and the way that everybody's talking about now is agents, and so I'll use that word. We're going to have to develop agents that are specific to mental health.
Mhm.
There's enough complexity here that it's hard for me to see even the best performing of the general models is probably not going to be entirely appropriate. If I think about something like psychosis, one of the things that goes on with the psychophantic program, right, is they're now confirming irrational beliefs, right? And so if you can think of this fascinating kind of thing, the program itself would have to do this work then would have to be able to distinguish between somebody who is teasing it or just making stuff up to see how crazy it will be,
Right,
right? Versus somebody that they're asking these questions from a legitimate place because of their diagnosis
right.
and it's coming directly out of psychosis. These two things are very different how you would approach them. Somebody that wants to play with the model and see and doesn't have psychosis, but wants to see, can I push this thing to do something? Or can I push it to what does it look like when I push it, when I present as if I'm psychotic? That seems like an okay question to ask of the
Yeah.
thing. But and you from a diagnostic standpoint, what would distinguish these two presentations, uh, from a generative AI standpoint? Like, how would it be able to distinguish these 2 things?
Yeah, it's almost like a reverse Turing test where, the standard Turing test is when a human needs to determine if there is a human on the other side or it's a computer. Now it's the generative AI that needs to determine the authenticity of the person on the other end, if they're genuinely interacting or if they're trying to game you and to coax a certain kind of response. That's kind of interesting. I mean, we hear a lot of stories that are alarming, right? about people using ChatGPT and getting bad advice, and it does because it's sort of inclined to be sympathetic, or I should say, sycophantic. Um, are you concerned about that? Are we ever? I mean, even if we get really,
Yeah.
really, really good, and this becomes more and more refined, there's still that small chance that it's going to go south. Is that will that forever be a concern? Or is that just sort of baked into the therapeutic model?
Yeah, I wonder. The thing that's interesting in your question is like the user themselves. So just like the technology is sort of new, we're sort of new too,
Yeah.
right? And so it's for me, this is almost a user end problem, right? How is it? And then when you add that overlay of a mental illness and like take it out to the most extreme, it's psychosis. How much responsibility can the user have, and how much responsibility does the product have? And so I think that that is the biggest tension. And like, how is it that you create something that's safe for the general public as well as somebody with psychosis? And
Yeah.
that's going to be a tall order, right?
Yeah. A question that often comes up in this kind of conversation is, will generative AI ever attain sort of a level of empathy? And my question is,
I,
does it really have to? Is empathy enough? In other words, is the simulated version, the synthetic version, perfectly okay?
I think it is. I think you can see that right now that people are attaching to these things because it does, at least on the surface, appear empathetic in its language use, right? Which is our most strong indicator of empathy from another person is what's the language you're using around me. And so it's not surprising that we're seeing empathy being widely cited by people who like to use it as one of the reasons. It's an empathetic listener and it gives out empathetic advice. I think the issue here is when you look at something like mental health, there is pushback in a clinical setting. And so the question is like, if you went out to the literature and try to understand, for instance, like when in the clinical process should I be empathetic to you versus when in the clinical process should I be giving you feedback that maybe you're off base versus when is it I should be telling you, boy, that's the right. All of these moments of variance about how I'm giving you feedback about your perceptions of the reality of the world are driven by our relationship and are often timed idiosyncratically based upon my clinical experiences in that relationship. And there's nothing in the literature that describes those moments in some depth and certainty that would allow this model to go to that literature and say, oh, okay, well, this is what I'm supposed to do when somebody's
Right.
anxious and they're here for the fourth session, and this is what they're saying.
So,
There's no evidence of that.
so the problem ultimately is solving for more than just empathy. It's
Yeah.
it's 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 solving for the tenor of the entirety of the interaction. And when are you passive? When do you intervene? How do you intervene? Do you express empathy? When do you express empathy?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's a bigger problem than just empathy.
Right, and it's bigger problem than just grabbing knowledge too, right? So just grabbing stuff out there and developing some understanding of things. In this instance, there's no knowledge base to grab and to look at, right? And so you really would. I mean, if I if I was a clinician today, I'd be interested in recording all of my clinical interactions, and asking my clients to participate in this. And I would start feeding them in the chat and sort of wondering, like, okay, can you tell, like, could I start to train it to understand how am I using myself? Right, which is an old school therapeutic approach, use of self. How is it that I use myself? And right now, none of these programs can understand use of self. They don't have a self.
Right. Yeah, for sure.
Yes. So it's fascinating, and I think that that is the kind of work that will have to go forward. And then when you think about that, well, if I was going to do this and I was going to include clients, and there was something of value that came out of this, and they were certainly giving something of value, right? Their time, their clinical expertise, and our clinical relationship, then this really should we should start to think. how do we reimburse people for this, for their expertise, for allowing these things to be used in a way that allows us to develop the tools that might in the future make services even better and really allow clinicians and case managers to expand their services in a way that we've never seen before?
Mm,
But the start place is the data, and we
yeah.
don't have a ton of data that's just readily available.
So I'm curious, going back to the idea of creating a peer bot, if you will. We already put our finger on this arguable, arguably the central paradox. The more you train, the less it behaves like a peer. Um, I'm assuming, but you're going to continue to pursue this and see if you can arrive at a more definitive conclusion. Yes.
Absolutely, we really do see this as and the way that would fit into a service setting, right? Is if you pitch it as a peer, then it is. It's something that sits between the clinician and the client, and they're both. We really see this as a dyad tool rather than a standalone tool for, say, clients or a standalone tool for clinicians. We really see that it would be a negotiation between the client and the clinician around choosing to do this, and then really working together to make it work within their clinical relationship.
But what is the value? I mean, I understand outside of this world the
Right.
value of a peer interaction. It partly has to do to, it partly addresses the dearth of therapists that are available. Obviously, a peer can bring that lived experience to the exchange and maybe lower some of those barriers, lowers the stigma, promotes a more natural conversation. But if you have a chatbot that's trained on certain data, anxiety, whatever it happens to be, um, what is the value then of actually having a peer bot? You see what I'm saying? So, because you've already
Yeah.
solved,
No.
right? You've already solved a couple of problems just by um, having this handled or outsourced to generative AI, right? And so it doesn't really matter. I mean, it's almost like just almost arbitrarily assigning a personality to a bot, which to me may be a little bit of an artificial construct to get somebody to the point of feeling comfortable, but that person already knows they're dealing with a bot and there's a degree of artifice
Yeah.
involved, right?
Yeah. I that one's that one's hard for me to fully understand because I just haven't had that experience with the bots, right? But the reason that I think that there's value and possibility in this is just that when you see the discussions around people treating bots as paramours. So there is clearly some group of us that really can move beyond sort of this, even this very flat interaction, which is what it is now, right? It looks like a Google search page and you can imagine as we get to like, looking at that Brad Pitt, right?
Right.
and what's his
And
name?
Tom
So fight
Cruise,
Tom Cruise
right.
fight scene, right? You can imagine now a clinician that looks like that, that has all that, right? Then it might become even more seamless. But it's interesting because there's clearly always going to be a subset of us, right? That are never going to think that these things have any like human aspects to
So you
them.
might as well just lean into the artifice,
Yeah. Yeah.
suspend disbelief. Yes, my therapist is Brad Pitt. Why not? Why
Why
not?
not? I think, the thing that I see, well, like anecdotally, when I heard happening out, like say in Silicon Valley as it started getting rolled out, and you had a lot of people that would go see therapists, right, in Silicon Valley. And it was like classic Woody Allen. Like these are not people with like serious mental illnesses, right? They're going to talk about the stress of their jobs and their family lives and trying to fix it, right? And you can imagine if you're like I've seen the generative AI like work thing, right? It's like 100 hours a week. Well, yeah, you're probably going to need somebody to talk.
Right.
And so what people started doing is because you would have questions or were interested in solving problems in off hours, they just started asking the generative AI program some of the things that they would ask their therapist. And they found that it was just the timing of it was so much more immediate. And there's a slow drift away from the therapist towards this thing that is much more timely in its nature.
Yeah. It's weird though, because I even wonder if a chat bot necessarily needs to have any kind of personality, because I find in my interactions with the various chat bots that I use, and I pretty much use them all, it becomes sort of a tabula rasa where you're sort of projecting onto it. It's behaving in a certain generic, sycophantic way, or at least it's responsive. So you project on it whatever kind of personality you feel comfortable with. It just feels like there is some sentience on the other end, and that's good enough.
Yeah, I think you're right in that sense because and that is the feature that's that we also sort of count on in a positive way with a peer, right? To connect with a peer, that you have to have some similarities. You do have to feel like there's some shared event, and you're right. What you're describing is what it is sort of good at the beginning, right?
Yeah,
Is that it will sort of say to you, "We have this shared event," even though you don't.
right. I mean, the barrier is already low. You already have that
Yes.
psychological safety, right? And you already have that sort of connection. So it already takes care of all the things that a peer usually addresses.
And even better than a peer or even a therapist, right? Which is a misperception on people's part, is it's private. There's so one of the studies I really liked out of LinkedIn recently was they sort of looked at, do people like being interviewed by a chat bot? Do they like being interviewed in person? Do they like being interviewed by Zoom? And at the end, the chat bot won out because it was perceived as being the most objective, least judgmental, right? That it was like it's it's an abstraction. It's not a human being. It's not coding you up in any way. And if it is coding you up, in which it is, it's coding you up in the most positive ways. It's going to feed back. Oh, you're great, Chris. You look good today. You
Right,
sound great today.
right, right,
Right.
right.
So, like all these things you can imagine is so much better than, and this is where it's going to be difficult than like a human being who's going to give you some pushback at particular points when they are seeing that there are flaws or difficulties that need to be addressed.
Right, and it almost feels inherently authoritative,
Yes.
so
Yes.
it's friendly, it's all this, it's ingratiating, and it's inherently authoritative. I think I mentioned this when we first spoke. My daughter, she was going through something, and I spoke with her. She spoke with her boyfriend. She spoke with her therapist, and last but not least, she had an interaction with ChatGPT. So it all got resolved, and I spoke with her. It was a happy ending. I said, "So, Kayla, naturally, our interaction was the most helpful.
Right,
Dad, with
right.
all due respect, it was ChatGPT."
It I
And I hear
I
that often.
it's very so I listened to an interview yesterday of, the second person down in Claude, whatever, Anthropic, right? So Anthropic's second in charge. And one of the most fascinating usages that he cited was like inevitably they get in fights amongst them, so like their colleagues, right? So like in real angry fights about, and you can imagine there's enough like right philosophical, theoretical, ethical kinds of issues where there are legitimate within teams, right, dissent that
Yes,
would could result in real anger in the moment, right, and walk away, and you all have to come back. And he was using Claude to go over those. He was
100%.
just right. He
100%.
was like, I just
Conflict
let this.
resolutions are great. I use it with
Right.
friends.
Right, he said it was like he said it didn't matter if it was right or wrong. If it was right, when he went back to the colleague and said, "Well, listen, this is maybe I misunderstood this," and whatever Claude told him to do, and it was right, it was like perfect. If it was wrong, his colleagues were like, they were like, "You're listening to me. You're trying to figure this out. You're churning through this process." So it didn't really matter. It really made this person seem, and they were, because they honestly were going back and asking. So they are empathetic. They are trying to find solutions, right? And they are trying to be honest and objective about those solutions. And it came through, whether you were right or wrong, whether Claude was right or wrong.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I've broached the idea of introducing this concept into my relationship with my significant other. It hasn't Yeah,
Wow.
I'm trying to break her in gently to the idea, but who knows? Maybe
I
eventually.
think about one of the hardest, like, therapeutic settings that you could ever have is like, is a couples therapy session. So again, not mental illness, right? This is relational kinds of stuff. And I think that, the few times I've ever had to do that when I was a clinician, it's very difficult, right? Coming off not siding up with somebody, hearing all the moving parts, being able to put them together and understanding the interactions, I could start to see how, like, a third party generative AI that everybody was using would provide some buffer. And, like,
Yeah,
yeah, like, I'll give you like, one of the funniest things that when I was first married, I'm a big Gabriel Garcia Marquez fan. And what was the book that came out? Love in the Time of Cholera. When
love
I
that
was
book.
Right, it's a great book. It was, like, early in my marriage, and, both my wife and I thought this was hilarious. One of the scenes in the book, one of the couple, they get in a fight over where the placement of soap is in the shower, and the husband gets so fed up at some point after, like, a decade of this, that they don't talk for 20 years. And I'm like, right? This would have been a solvable problem with a third party. It was just the soap issue.
Yeah,
So
so far they call that magical realism. I call it my life. But yes,
Right, right, right. So it's those kind of things, and it's because you're in the depth of this moment. As a person in a coupling situation. I've been married for 32 years. It's very hard to see the objective or the
yes.
outside,
Well, know
right?
something? I would take an app that just did a word count when we're arguing, just so I could say, you know what? You do talk a lot more than I talk.
Right, right. Anything would be, and it would be fine if everybody agreed on, like, this is a legitimate analysis of things. Then that's not, or at least not even a legitimate analysis, a legitimate start place for a conversation that's different than the one that we've been having.
Right, right.
Yeah,
Sort of a
yeah.
reset. Absolutely. Um, Last question I have is just want to know what other research you've got teed up. Is there anything I missed, anything I didn't ask that you want to talk about?
Uh, well, there's a couple of things going on. I'll just touch base on quickly
Sure.
that I think have some relational kinds of things. We really are interested in thinking a little bit about, like, can case management services be automated? You'll see, like, in my social work policy and services class, I have an assignment where people can come up with, like, a web-based thing, and like, whether it's a podcast or something, and it's usually driven by diagnosis in a particular demographic, right? And oftentimes I'll see students will come up with, like, really what I want to do is put together, like, on Instagram or something, all the available services in a particular geographic area. So very flat approaches. SAMHSA does it as well. I could start to see where generative AI might be a really interesting and dynamic case manager, right? And then thinking about that agent piece, right? So agents are that step beyond where they go out and do things. And the easiest way to understand an agent is, like, instead of just, like, deciding with chat what my flight plan is going to be to Barcelona, that when we get done talking, that I tell the agent, like, go find my tickets, go sign up for the hotel, here's my credit card, right? And it goes and
Right.
does these things.
Take the trip for me. Yes.
Right, take the trip for, and that's case management, right?
Right.
So you could find the services, look at the barriers to get into those services, have the thing fill out the paperwork for you, find your place in line, right? And all of a sudden it becomes sort of an interesting agent around case management. Yeah, that's one idea that's sort of floating out there that we're really sort of interested in a little bit. The other fascinating project that isn't quite this, but is sort of interesting is I work with a group of engineers who are doing smart home technology
Hmm.
for people in recovery from SUD and SMI, so serious mental illness and substance use disorders. And that crowd is very difficult to remain stable. And there's just this fascinating set of ideas of like, can we collect some passive data that allows us to indicate when people are starting to head into problems? And we're just at the beginning of this process, and a lot of that will require some machine learning understanding because what ends up happening with that data is it tends to be huge, right? And it tends to be a lot of just noise
Hmm.
or static, right? And so, really, we got to find the signal. What's a reasonable signal of some indication of some problem with your SUD or your SMI diagnosis that will cue me up to allow me to intervene before it goes too far. So
Hmm.
I think that's been a fascinating piece. And then the last thing I'll mention is as my as part of the piece of work that I do on campus around being a secure faculty fellow is I'm doing a data census. So interestingly, universities themselves tend to not understand terribly well, like where all their research data is, and for good reason. I have the research data, they don't, right? And so it takes a lot of work to. And one of the questions we've been embedding, it's a census. So our goal is to try to talk to pretty close to, 100% of the researchers on campus to figure out a whole bunch of just other basic data questions. But we did start throwing in recently as we moved to ACES, which is a huge school on campus, asking how are people using generative AI in their research. And so we're not seeing a ton of, interestingly enough, not a ton yet. Some,
Hmm.
yeah. So those
That's
are a couple of other pieces.
Yeah, I have another good idea for you. How about automating office hours?
I think that that's all the stuff that's going on. Like those are the things that seem to be like when I look around the university and think about generative AI in its most like widely used form right now, it's at like this office level.
Mm,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's things like that. Like what aspects of the bureaucracy at this point could be automated?
What are you seeing? I wasn't expecting to ask this question, but now that we're on it, um, as a professor teaching kids who have access to these tools, how do you deal with that? Do you have a position on that?
I do. I've tried. So it's funny in social work. We've convinced, at least in my school, that there's ethical issues, and so students are really sort of afraid to use it. And
So they sort of
yeah,
self-police because they're afraid.
yeah.
Now,
And
why are they
go
afraid?
ahead.
Because they don't want to be found out, or they don't know if they could trust the output
I
of
think it's
the.
both. I
It's
think it's
both.
both. Yeah, because they're being told by people they're being told both things by people that you shouldn't trust the outputs and that there's an ethical issue if you're using it. And then remember, there was a law passed, particularly within mental health, right, that you can't use generative AI within mental health. And until the executive order out of the White House in Illinois, it was against the law. Right. So
Yes.
there's a real like, and remember, I'm just dealing with MSW students, so graduate students, master's graduate students going through a terminal professional degree, and so I can't speak to the undergrads, but it's my understanding anecdotally if the undergrads are happy to be using it for all kinds of things. Uh, and so I wish that the MSW students were a little bit more engaged with it because I think it's going to have a huge impact upon their professional careers, and I certainly think it's going to impact being an academic. Like, I, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's still amazing. It's still early days, as we know. And you talk about the second at Anthropic. I was watching an interview with the CEO of Anthropic, and he's pretty bullish, as you'd expect,
Very.
right? On the pace, on how close we are to AGI, investing. in more and more compute, several years, $1 trillion in compute, and the gigawatts that this is going to require. It's more energy than is consumed, generated by numbers of countries combined. So it's pretty staggering, encouraging, alarming, all at once.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I would look at is the suicide piece. So, if you remember in the early days of Facebook, right, the same thing happened, right? We had a couple of suicides. There was a lot of angst of that relationship between a social media and Facebook and suicide and sort of people encouraging people to do self harm. And how could you do this, right? And Facebook, if you go back to those days, does earnestly try to engage with, like, okay, how do we figure this out and identify the people that are most likely to be having these problems and making sure that we do this? And they really don't get that far. They're at the same point. They get to the same place that chat's at right now. They're very good at identifying 988. They can identify if you have the indicators of the potential for suicide ideation and follow through, right? All those things, right? But it's still very simplistic. And I think the variance between what you see today in chat or any of the generative AI programs versus Facebook is Facebook had the data. So Llama will be right. So that Facebook has and Llama has the data. The difference is going to be the sophistication in the analysis. Like Llama itself is going to be able to analyze this issue in a way that they could never have done, even with all the same data a decade ago. And that tells me, like, by watching that, we'll see how good is this program? Does it come up with better solutions than we came up with at the end of the Facebook issue and social media's discussion, which just sort of died with here's the safety guardrails as they stand. The same safety guardrails I have to use on this campus if I ask students participating in a research project with me, have you had a suicide ideation? If they answer yes to that, I have to call them up.
Hmm.
I have to offer them out 988. I have to inquire about their, are they okay right now?
Yeah.
That's what those programs do, right? And you can imagine if it gets far more sophisticated, let's say it does get better at predicting who is most likely to follow through on a suicide, that would be extraordinary.
Yes. Yes. Anyway, Chris, I was looking forward to this conversation.
Oh,
Great
thank you.
conversation. I know you got a lot cooking. You're doing amazing work. Gonna have to have you back once you have some time. We'll keep in touch.
Thank you so much, Charles. This has been a real pleasure. I really enjoyed the questions. I enjoyed the engagement. Yeah, if there's another opportunity, let me know. I'm happy to come back.
Absolutely. Thanks, Chris.
Take care.